Very good. And then, once again, a very good afternoon to everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. This is our webinar in partnership with Life After All, called Should I Stay or Should I Go? Voices from within and beyond the oil and gas industry. I'm Fabien Littel. I'm a lecturer in people and organizations at Oxford Brookes University, a former employee from an oil and gas company as well. I'll say a bit more about that in a minute. And I'll just hand over to Grace to introduce herself.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone, or morning, wherever you are. I'm really great to have you with us today. Thanks for joining. I'm an associate professor in business and society at the University of Bath in the UK.
Thank you, Grace. So we'll start with our presentations, and what you'll hear today are two presentations. You'll hear from me first in my research, which involved oil and gas existing and former employees, and then I'll hand over to Grace, who has also conducted a study, with that same population, with a different angle to it. So you'll hear different perspectives and perhaps this different way, different lenses through which we've seen those experiences, which hopefully will resonate with some of you who have gone through those experiences and be of interest to others in other kinds of circumstances. So I'm going to start with my research, which is called Coping, Hoping and Acting: Employees' Individual Ethics for Climate Change in the Oil and Gas Industry. Now, don't fear too much. It's not, I've prepared the presentation so that it's not too academic, and I really focus on bringing out the voices of participants who have very kindly taken part in the study. The QR code you have on the screen here takes you to the paper, one of the papers that comes from my research, the one that is already available with a journal called Organization Studies, and it's open access, so everyone can access it and download it if it's of interest. So this is my research, which I've done in the context of the PhD that I've recently completed at the University of Southampton before taking on my lectureship with Oxford Brookes. I started my PhD, 4 years ago, nearly now, to transition into academia after a career in HR, which has involved a career in oil and gas for 7 years. I worked with BP in all my roles in corporations. I was in different disciplines, which within the HR, the world of HR, in various talent management, generalist, business partnering, etc., etc. So when it came to starting a PhD, to starting this transition, I was very interested in studying individual ethics in morally challenging context. As you can see the cartoon on the screen here. The reason for that was twofold. As many researchers, there's my own experience, which has kind of fed into my interest. Obviously, I had worked in oil and gas, but the last few years, I also worked after I left oil and gas, where I felt some moral dissonance, not necessarily regarding the environment. If I'm honest, it was more to do with perhaps leadership practices and other matters. But then I moved to the defense industry, so defense contractors for a few years, where I experienced a more acute ethical challenge to do with the arms trade and human rights. So this has led me to leave the organization and really to be interested in actually how people do feel within organizations when their values, their sense of self don't necessarily align with what the organization stands for or the organization's impact in the world. And at the time, even though I had left BP a good few years back, I remained really interested in what was going on with the energy transition and the discourses, the purpose, all of that that happened with BP and elsewhere as well. And so I wanted to go back into that industry to study it and hear from people. So for the purpose of what we're talking about today and for my study, there is an assumption of the oil and gas being positioned as a morally challenging industry. And some people, as I started my study, challenged that, saying, well, actually, why do you, where is the ethical challenge? People came to me saying, no, we're the good guys. What are you talking about? And so there's a few items here. On the left, you can see a cartoon from First Dog on the Moon from The Guardian, which illustrates some of the perhaps public opinion and perception, that might be out there with regards to the fossil fuel industry, which illustrates, many people's views perhaps around, the hegemonic approach of the industry as a whole. Equally, there's been a number of news articles. Just put a headline here about Exxon with the revelations about the how they had predicted effectively back in the 70s what fossil fuels would do to the environment and to climate, but had silenced or find ways to for that not to go out in the world. And the final extract was just a headline, a more recent headline that is, about oil company shares soaring right now, because we are having this webinar, we're having this discussion in a very challenging context in itself, with the war in the Middle East and war that has been taking place in other parts of the world now for quite a while, which adds an extra moral dimension to the industry, both in its contribution to what is going on, but also to how profits perhaps from soaring oil prices might be perceived by employees, and I'll come back onto that as some have expressed challenges. So the title of my research was Coping, Hoping, and Acting, and it reflects the three areas that I've been investigating. First, I was interested to understand how people justified their involvement with the oil and gas industry. And when I say justify, it's again, when faced with some items from the public opinion, from the public domain that are challenging the industry's impact in the world. For that, I interviewed 30 people who worked at the time of interviews, at least within the oil and gas industry. Those same 30 interviews helped me take a different lens, where I looked at what I called hoping, which is more about how people construct their individual position with regards to climate change. And how that compares with the industry's discourses, and I'll explain a bit more about that in a bit. And for that, I also studied, analyzed corporate documents from the five major big oil private companies, so annual reports and CEO and board speeches. And for the third part, acting, it's a little bit of a shift. I've looked at people, at 7 stories of individuals who used to work in the industry but decided to leave and move to more of a climate activist or climate lobbying, some degree of climate action in their next activity. And I was interested in that transition in particular. How do you sort of craft and develop that response and that element of what you'll do next? So to start with, I just wanted to share the findings and the discourses that I got from the industry, from the analysis of those annual reports. And 3 themes came out. And it's worth saying as well that these were on the 2022 annual reports and other things from that time, which were released early 2023. And obviously, those discourses might have even changed slightly just in the last couple of years, because back a couple of years ago, we were still in some areas talking. But the first discourse that came out was about the industry being on the right track, about doing good for now and for the future. So really being in that positive place, doing the morally right thing, as an extract from the BP annual report here, saying we have a plan, the strategy is working, and our people are fully behind it. Now it is about execution operationally and strategically. I nearly said tragically here. Obviously, with the benefit of hindsight, this perhaps hasn't worked out in the way that was intended in that quote, but this was the position that was shared back then. Similarly, a second discourse was about the industry being pragmatic and realistic. Pragmatic in the sense that there's a lot of language about cautious transition, for example, and the fact that the industry includes a lot of knowledge in the industry, obviously engineers, lots of extremely knowledgeable experts, and that is crucial for the development or the move to a different energy model. So from Exxon, a quote saying it would be folly to exclude so many of the world's top engineers and scientists from helping craft the solutions of the future. And finally, another discourse that came through was that of the industry being deeply embedded at the heart of a strong and influential network. Through their shareholder, through partners, through local communities, the message here is that it's an industry that is part of our everyday lives, but that is also economically very much involved. And from an employee perspective, I chose that quote from Total Energy, saying, as part of an ambition agreement designed to boost employee shareholding to 10% of our capital, we've agreed on terms that will encourage even more of our employees to become shareholders. This is just about again how employees are becoming really tangled into the interest of the industry. And as someone who had to untangle myself because of my academic writing, it takes a fair bit of effort to be able to declare that you are free from interest in the industry. So these discourses are both narratives as well as things that shape the industry and the organization's actions, the way that they operate. So looking at the perspective from employees, the first one that I looked at is the one that I called coping, which is about justification, about looking at how people make sense of their belonging in the industry. And for that, I used a theory. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but it's called moral disengagement. And what it is effectively is a series of mechanisms which allow people to lift their moral self-censorship and effectively allow them to engage in activities which otherwise they would have perhaps stopped themselves. So I'll just illustrate a few of these mechanisms with quotes here. First one, for example, was somebody that says, you could say the ambulance that picks the old lady up who's had a heart attack and takes her to hospital, that was powered by petrol, diesel that came from a well, that the energy that they had in the hospital, that was probably powered from fossil fuels, hydrocarbons. And that's what we would call moral justification. And it's not wrong. The point here is that taking that perspective sort of stops you from perhaps considering what an alternative might be out there, what a different, approach there might be. The second one, called advantages comparison, someone who said I had not morally made the connection between the company and what they did and some moral stake that I had to make in this. Whereas if you'd said to me, go and work for gambling or tobacco, I would have said, no way, I wouldn't even consider working for them. So advantages comparison is all about finding another sort of aspect, another set of activity, which is also has a detrimental impact, even more so than what you're engaged with, in order to say, well, actually, we're not quite as bad because some people are doing worse things. Next one, which is euphemistic labeling. I don't want to use the words oil and gas. I'm proud to work for an energy company. So this is all about how you use actual words and what words you choose to use for the meaning and the connotations that they have. And many people here, wanted to go away from the terms oil and gas to go towards energy. And there were other examples. A particular example that I quite like from outside of the oil and gas industry, but from tobacco, was how their reports referred to pharmacological satisfaction instead of addiction. So this is kind of how euphemistic labeling kind of works. Next one, the Earth is never gone burned, right? It'll get a bit hotter. That's again just an illustration of what could be minimizing or distorting consequences. Where people look, in this case, at the impact of climate change, and argue that things are perhaps blown out of proportion, and that it might not be quite as bad as people think. And finally, diffusion of responsibility. I'm just one individual, and if I do the right thing, which I would always try to do, I'm relying on 6 billion people around the world to do the same. So this is effectively saying it's not just me, there's so many of us in that I can't be taking all the blame. So what these mechanisms do is, one, allow people to carry on with what they do. Not everyone has got the ability, the privilege even, to be able to make a change. But for others, it kind of stops them to engage with what might otherwise lead to a change of some sort. And this is where I'm going next with hoping, which is about how people within this context are actually creating their individual sense of what is the right way to operate. And for that, I analyzed how people position themselves towards the company discourses. So if you think about those three discourses I talked about before, the first one in there, so there's a whole range. First one is about championing and perpetuating. So people who are align and basically not just repeat, but kind of amplify those discourses and the company's position. The quote here about, you need to do this, but how you do is up to you, is all about deregulation. So looking at empowering organizations even more. So really supporting those efforts and the strategies that they're taking. Another position that people are taking is about displacing and justifying. Here in this quote, looking at the political will to make things happen that would give a CEO more power to continue on a more positive path. So basically, again, about regulation, but this is, when confronted with their relation or impact into the organization, people kind of deflecting and moving on to another area. Then there was a good number of people who were what I called follow and trust. So the quote here, you have to trust in the organization. I wouldn't have been there for too long if I didn't feel that they were always trying to do the right thing, whether or not they are, which is interesting. So those are individuals who at that point were sort of almost outsourcing their moral concerns, saying, look, I decide to trust the organization. Perhaps people who had, other things that they were concerned with, and therefore had made a conscious decision that they were putting their trust in the organization. Then people who started to challenge, not to challenge to an extent, but to evaluate, to not just take everything for what it looks like. Someone here saying, I always said the organization, it gives you the illusion that it couldn't do anything wrong. So talking about illusion here suggests, well, actually, there might be something in it to dig into. And finally, a good few people who moved into what are called challenge and distance. The quote here, we can talk about hydrogen, we can do all the fanfare and the LinkedIn post and all that BS. At the end of the day, this company has made its money on its oil and gas business. So again, someone calling BS on the company discourses and people trying to, again, make that break between themselves and the industry. How that works, again, what I hope to be a relatively simple model with an individual at the heart of it, the individual at the heart of it, influenced by feelings and emotions from what's happening around themselves. And a process, I presented those sort of positions, but it's a process that is an ongoing process of reassessing and shaped by different aspects. And I found it's shaped by consideration of societal factors, so inequalities, privileges, what happens in the public domain by the way of feedback and impressions and call for action, but also relational. There was a huge amount of people who were mentioned quotes from loved ones, from siblings, from children even. Someone was brought to tears by just the mention of thinking about, their daughter and how they explain to them what contribution they've had into the world. And all of this reassessment then positions people towards, the institutional discourses and those systems and decide to actually either, go along or start shaping a different alternative that may exist. And finally, going to the area of acting here, which is all about, so this is where I studied people who made a change, who made quite a radical transformation in their career, decided to leave the organization. And so that led us to considering an in-between space, so where new things are possible. So people having one foot outside of the industry, one foot kind of still in, and perhaps starting to be within the world of activism, lobbying, or other, but in a world where they're full of possibilities. And within that space, what I found in terms of attributes from people is that they were giving a lot of emphasis on their education, knowledge building. So spending quite a lot of time educating themselves effectively, reflecting on themselves, those around them, shaping that vision of the self and looking at fulfillment, flourishing, and putting care and relationality in for the greater good. I've got a few quotes here. I'll just read a couple. That one is quite a powerful one. For someone who said, "After my son was born, I had a very harsh realization on a personal level that I didn't want to be involved in drilling anymore and left the industry quite abruptly within a few months. I don't want to go back myself, but I don't harbor any resentment towards people, towards the industry, and very grateful for my experiences. I now make a personal choice with my time alive to be part of the change." The next ones were about the need to educate and how people are educating themselves. And a final one here on perhaps that fulfillment. Someone saying, "I hope that health and happiness is what me and my family get to experience. And I hope I get to nurture my creative side, which I've ignored for too long. And I hope to get to make a contribution to the bigger change." So to conclude on my part, this is just a visual that brings those three areas of coping, hoping, and acting together. So with that central loop, which perpetuates the status quo effectively, where people rely and follow organizational discourses, perhaps use more disengagement. And then you can see that it's all, porous because people can go into shaping those alternative modes of being in hoping through influences from around them, and then create those in-between spaces through developing their knowledge, reflection, care, etc., and find a way to move towards those alternatives. And I'll leave it at that for now. I've taken a fair bit of time, so I will move on to hand over to Grace to present a different perspective on this phenomenon. Over to you, Grace.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Fabien. So we both started these projects completely separately and without knowledge of one another around a very similar time. And the QR code that I'm sharing here on this slide is actually to a podcast that I did with an outlet called The Conversation. And that podcast shows a lot of these or illustrates a lot of these same findings in a bit more detail. So I just wanted to give people access to that as well if they hadn't seen that yet. So Fabien, I'm ready for you to change the slides. Sorry, I'll rely on you here with this one. Okay, great. So when I started studying this phenomena, I first saw the video that I'm sure many of you saw as well from Caroline Dennett, who was leaving Shell as a consultant in 2022. And I really hadn't thought much about the idea of leaving your job over, moral or climate consciousness, but she really put this on the map for me. And around the same time, back in the good old days of Twitter, there was a really interesting thread from a Bloomberg journalist, just generally interested in people leaving their jobs because of climate concerns or in order to fight. There was a moment where these, I was seeing more and more people talking about this, but I wasn't finding a lot of research on the topic. And so, Phoebe, and I'm ready for the next slide. So what I did is an interview-based study, and I tried to identify people who had left the oil and gas industry because of climate concerns, as well as a sort of interesting group of people who have expressed climate concerns, in public fora or through groups, at work, but they are choosing to stay in the industry, at least for now. And so I was really curious to compare these two groups and to compare their journeys, their experiences, and sort of their understanding of the climate crisis and their employer's role in it, as well as their role in their employment situation. So I've ended up with about 25 interviews from individuals who've left and 10 from climate concerned remainers. Sorry to put the remainer label with anyone who's got a Brexit kind of idea in mind, but the remainers being those people who have climate concerns but have chosen, again, at least for now, to stay in the industry. So I started to compare these two groups based on my interviews, and I've got a number of different things that I found. The first one is that both groups reported that they were happy in most aspects of their jobs. So they didn't really fit this idea of a sort of disgruntled employee that we might assume, leads to quitting behavior. And a lot of them expressed that they were not even considering leaving and or hadn't left because of problems with the role or because of the job itself. But the second thing that I found is that they also both expressed increased concern with the climate crisis over time. So all the signals that they were getting, looking out into the media or through reports from the IEA, were that this is becoming a more serious problem, and it's a problem that is going to need to be addressed sooner rather than later. So both groups acknowledged the severity of the issue and the urgency of the issue. And as they were paying closer attention to this, they started to question their employer's role in perpetuating the problem. And so both groups again were very aware of the critiques and criticisms against their employers, especially when, for example, Fabien said, when it came out that, what Exxon knew regarding climate change in the 70s and 80s and chose not to share, to say in a euphemistic way. And so when the news would hit with certain stories like that, these employees in particular were aware and paying attention to those accounts. And that's, again, both those who chose to leave as well as those who chose to stay when I interviewed them. The next factor is that they both went through at least a period of trying to rationalize their employer's actions. And this again connects to some of those moral disengagement pieces that Fabien picked up on. So basically trying to say, we're doing the best we can, or it's really a distributed problem, a distributed issue. We can really only change when regulators force us to change or when demand changes. And so really rationalizing this sort of slow and steady approach to the transition. I also found that most individuals tried to pursue some level of change from within, whether or not they ended up staying or leaving. So this could mean trying to change their roles so that they're working on a team that's more focused on the energy transition, all the way to working with employee resource groups that are sustainability oriented, or just speaking up at an AGM or speaking up at meetings. So what this voice behavior looks like is different for different people. But again, amongst both groups, most individuals reported some level of either trying to influence their peers or trying to influence leadership to get them to pay more attention to the problem. This is where we start to see a split. So those people who remained felt that their internal efforts were making a small difference. They hoped and believed that change from the inside was necessary, even if it was slow. They acknowledged that it was slow or small wins. And they still held a belief or a hope that their employers would eventually get on the right track, and that they were providing essential services for today that were necessary for the current environment that we're in, and they chose to stay based on these considerations. So again, it's not that these individuals may never leave, but at the time of my interviewing them, these were sort of their rationales and their views on the situation. On the other hand, those people who chose to leave described coming to a different conclusion. So they talked about a growing sense of disillusionment and really a feeling like they had no choice but to leave. They started to see more and more things at work as hypocritical or greenwashing, basically things that were being said publicly, but they didn't see evidence of internally, like investment in new technology or in the transition. They describe feeling intense values conflict and feeling a limited feelings of efficacy. So basically not feeling like, okay, I'm being allowed to voice this opinion in certain circles, but is it really making a change? Is it really having any kind of difference in what we're doing day to day as a company? They also talked again about that increased urgency around the climate crisis over and above, what they might have felt before. And finally, they talk a lot about experiencing what they term cognitive dissonance, which is an idea where your beliefs and your actions are mismatched in some way. So when you're facing cognitive dissonance, you can try to update your beliefs, change what you're thinking. But in this case, they had a really hard time changing their thinking and decided that it was too incongruent to continue to work within the industry with the beliefs that they held. And so at that point, they felt they again had literally no choice but to leave, often doing so in not a rushed manner, but not necessarily having great alternatives set up. So, not necessarily in an overly strategic manner or in a manner that might benefit their career. In fact, some people report really taking a step back, but feeling like they had no choice in the matter. So finally, I've said this, leavers concluded that their only option was to exit their organizations. So I pick up on something in the data, and this is where my theoretical angle comes in. These are called imaginaries, and these are sort of vivid ideas about the future and how we get from here to there. So you could think of this as a vision with a pathway. Obviously, anyone who's worked for Shell knows a lot about scenarios. So these are all sort of ideas about what's the future that I desire and how do I attempt to help us realize that future. And what I noticed was that the folks who chose to stay had more of a measured imaginary. The first part of that is that they generally defended their employer's approach to the transition. So I've got a couple quotes here to show what that looks like. So the first one, sorry, I'll back up. What's interesting here is that I can also speak to those people who left about how they felt when they were in the inside and prior to making the choice to leave. So even though I don't have many remainers that I've spoken to, I get a lot of insight into these measured imaginaries or this rationalization process from people who have left, but who are telling me about how they used to think. So this person who has left said at the time, I always saw the rationale from the Shell side as well as the rationale from the other side and was able to balance those two issues. It's never black and white. It's always a story of two sides. So they were actively engaging in trying to take the perspective of or empathize with their employer when they were operating through the measured imaginary. Another person says something very similar, even though, again, this individual eventually decided to leave. So she says, I used to defend it, that it could change. I used to say, well, Shell is the only one going to be leading in renewable energy, and I don't believe that anymore. So she talks about how she's sort of broken out of that measured imaginary. And finally, someone who's still within the industry giving this defense, saying these companies are massive, the industry is huge, it has so much infrastructure, you can't turn the Titanic around. So this analogy I heard a couple of times, you can't turn the Titanic around. We're already too big, we're too overinvested in the status quo, it's going to have to be slow. It takes a lot. You can't just go 0 to 100 degrees, 180 degrees, you have to move 1 degree at a time. So justifying this approach, this slow and steady measured approach to the transition. And the second part of the measured imaginary is applying a distributed attribution of blame. So basically saying it's a whole system needs to change and we're being unfairly targeted in some way with being asked to lead that transition. And I think, again, you saw that in Fabien's data as well. So the first quote I have here says, when demand changes, the industry will change. Customers need to be willing to change. So basically, looking out into the ecosystem as to who else needs to make a decision to change that will then incentivize the main players in the industry to respond accordingly. And the second person has a similar view. What's going to drive change really in the end is whether or not it's compelling from a consumer standpoint. And then go ahead and show the third quote there too. And this is more about the roadblocks being with the regulators. So whether it's customers or regulators, this idea is that there's being some sort of unfair blame placed squarely on the major industry players. Okay, so the second imaginary is more of a transformational imaginary, and this is what people tend to embrace in their journey of exiting their roles in their companies. So the first one is coming to the belief that their internal efforts are pointless or not really affecting any change. So I've got a few quotes showing what this looks like as well. So one person who left said, in the grand scheme of my employer, this is a tiny, tiny drop in the ocean. And I think that's where my cognitive dissonance, if you like, started to materialize, where I felt actually it wasn't making any real progress or real difference. Another person saying, I got the message from the chief scientist that while he fully acknowledged how important this was and how big of a deal climate change was, and that they were fully aware of climate change, they weren't going to spend any money on this in the next 50 years. And that was a trigger for me to say, well, this is not going anywhere. A lot of this is about recognizing that the companies are not acting as urgently as these employees feel they should be. So they're starting to reject this measured approach. And another person saying, when there's clearly no desire from corporate leadership to pursue anything except the relentless extraction of fossil fuels and pursue profit, it's impossible to drive positive change from within. And then I think in the interest of time, I'll just read out, Fabien, if you wouldn't mind just showing the quotes here, great. Yeah, I'll just read out the first one there. So the second part of the transformational imaginary is applying a concentrated blame on employers. So this is in opposition to this distributed blame, the regulator needs to do something, customers need to do something. It's coming to the belief that actually it's my company that really should be doing more. And so one thing the first person says here is, one thing I found really frustrating was the difference between public statements that the company has and then the day-to-day, how that gets watered down. And how hypocritical decisions were. So basically starting to see their employer as, really, leading the problem, contributing over and above to the problem through duplicitous behavior or hypocritical behavior. Okay, we can move to the next slide. So when you put these two imaginaries side by side, one thing I think that is really interesting is in the next column here, that actually both people who decide to stay and have the climate concerns but are still kind of working on change from within, as well as the people who decide to leave, they both have a similar diagnosis of the problem. They both see climate change as real and urgent, and they both understand that their employer has an active role to play in either improving or worsening the situation. So there's a shared understanding here. And the second thing that is also shared is this vision of what that desirable future looks like. Both groups want a prosperous and peaceful society that overcomes the threat of the climate crisis. Both groups are concerned with societal collapse or chaos. This comes up in both sets of interviews. It's just about what that pathway looks like that differs between the two groups. So in the narrative of how to get from here to there, how to get there, the first group, we need slow and measured change to avoid societal collapse. And the second group saying we need rapid transformational change to avoid societal collapse. So both groups, again, trying to avoid the same horrible outcome, but seeing different pathways there. They also have different ideas about where the blocks are that are blocking progress, where the roadblocks are. So the measured change folks see distributed blame. They sometimes talk about activists not helping the situation. Regulators should be doing more. We would change if consumers are willing to change. Whereas the transformational change folks mainly start to centralize the blame on the fossil fuel industry, although they do recognize that systems change is needed, but they see the fossil fuel industry as a main current roadblock to change. And that means there's different roles for the incumbents. So in the measured change imaginary, there's the hope that incumbents are essential players. We can't do it without them. We're too invested in the current system. We need them. We need their talent. We need their resources. We need them to make the change. And the transformational change imaginary sort of can do without the fossil fuel industry leading change. Change needs to come from all places and all actors. So they don't really centralize the fossil fuel industry as leaders in the transition. And finally, my personal role in getting us there, this is about where you see your career. In the measured change imaginary, in the first box there, sorry, Fabien. Yeah. My role is to stay inside, push the fossil fuel incumbents or my employer to hopefully embrace deeper or faster change, to get the issue on the agenda and try to pursue insider change work. Whereas the transformational imaginary is really trying to enable and lift up industry challengers, ecosystem actors, with this idea that actually starving the fossil fuel incumbents of talent and critiquing them, damaging their societal reputation might be a more effective approach given the situation we're in. And there's also an effort to continue those ties. And this goes into the Life After Oil group, back to insiders to continue to enable them to lead change from within, even if I've personally decided I can't stay in the industry. Okay, great. I think Fabien, you've got a couple more slides, and then we're going to bring in someone from Life After Oil briefly to talk about the connection between our work and what Life After Oil is doing, and then we're going to open up to Q&A. Hopefully, we still have about 10 minutes of Q&A at the end.
Thank you, Grace. I'll be brief on that on this point. I mean, it follows really from where Grace left off in terms of insiders looking or working together with levers. Do we change from within? Do we change from the outside, or do we change together? You can see on the. I'll let you have a look at those quotes. And I don't have time to go in detail in the image and the metaphor of the tree versus the rhizome, but just again in a nutshell, it's about driving that transformation, not so much as one individual, but more as a network that allows to have those offshoots. And so just sharing a bit of an extra step to my research, where I brought together some of the existing oil and gas industry individual employees and levers, and had what we call a storytelling workshop, effectively, with a live drawer, which is what you can see on the screen now. So they were very short, very small, only a few people in there, but they were invited to share their personal story while the live drawer was drawing. So to get that connection at a human level, and then have some time to think about a sustainable vision. And some of the things you can see on the screen here came up. Some groups worked extremely well connected at that human level. I'll be completely honest that some groups were a bit more challenged in reaching that position, but it helped understand how we can make that happen and what sort of interventions, how we can shape the conversation. And those are some of the quotes that the artist captured as well from what was said in terms of how there's more that unites us than divides us between leavers and remainers, how much we've got in common. There doesn't need to be shame. That was somebody who was very challenged from the inside, for example. So some quite positive insights there. And what we are working on with Grace, and this is where we reconnect with Life After Oil, is that we are hoping, and we're working through our respective institutions now to get this all lined up and approved, but we're getting there, to organize and offer workshops like these as well, which might be for existing oil and gas employees or recent leavers as well, to engage in looking at their individual ethics, their story, sharing between and together exploring these possible alternatives. So to remain in touch with those, for those who might be interested, make sure you do one of the two things, or both actually, that are on the screen here, which is joining the Life After All mailing list. It's the QR code on the right, and follow Life After All on LinkedIn. Sorry, the other one was on the left, this one on the right. And talking about Life After All, we're very fortunate and very happy to have Jackie Rothwell with us today, whose story you will find on the Life After All website as well. I'll hand over to you, Jackie, just to introduce yourself a little bit and perhaps share a few reflections about what you've heard from Grace, myself, and from your experience altogether.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Fabien. So I remember when I first heard both Fabien's and Grace's research and some of the insights, and I think it was being told just before I was coming out to talk about my story, and I almost felt like my thunder had been taken. Everything I'd thought about, everything I'd felt, all of the various stages I'd gone through, it was perfectly resonated in what they'd found. But in some ways, that was also really encouraging to see that it wasn't in my head. It wasn't something that I was being overly dramatic about. It wasn't something that I was being over the top about, really. And this was something that, as I went through the stages of working within an oil and gas company and then making that decision to leave, something that was really, really challenging. I went through the various stages of, at a time when net zero targets came out, feeling really hopeful and like what I was doing was really aligned, a real opportunity to make a big systems change, that the large companies were required to make that systems change, and this was the best place to do it. And then I remember as the transition started to slow, I started to rethink what was potentially possible and where the best influence and impact could really be within within my role and my career. I really struggled with some of the narratives that I was hearing internally as the strategy started to change and as the transition started to slow. I struggled with the rhetoric around pragmatic solutions and as if trying to push for the energy transition and for climate solutions was maybe an unpragmatic approach. That was really tough for me personally. And I just remember I was getting towards the point where I would go into work daily and it would just be getting tougher and tougher around what I'm seeing in the external world versus what I'm hearing in the office itself. So then I took the decision to leave kind of by myself. Life After All didn't exist at that time. But then since the network's been set up, what's been really fantastic is to both connect with others who have already left. And in some ways, especially if you do end up moving into something like a role in the climate space, in some instances, there aren't many ex-oil and gas people there. And so it can feel almost a coming home to be able to speak with former employees and be able to share some of those experiences around how you're translating what was taken through the oil and gas career into the new world and where the similarities or differences might be. So it's really helpful to have that community around. And then the other aspect of it, which is more looking and potentially more useful to those who are considering around leaving. I've had an incredible number of people reach out who are going through exactly the same thought process that every one of us has been through individually, discussing around how to go about it. What did you practically do? Where do I even start? It feels like such a daunting thing, especially if you've been within the industry for 10, 15, 20, 25, 30 years. So talking about some of the practicalities of, okay, break it down into small chunks. X, Y, and Z is the places to start. Don't try and do everything at once. And often there aren't clear answers or solutions, but just speaking with someone is incredibly powerful. It makes you feel like what you're doing is worthwhile, it's worth pursuing. It gives you that energy to continue to persevere with potentially a longer endeavor of trying to leave the industry and trying to find another solution. So that's across Life After Oil, we've got a real breadth of different different group members, huge depth of both experience. Some have been within the industry for 5, 10 years. Others have been in the industry for 40 years. We've got people who've left at various points in their career and all sorts of different backgrounds who've then gone on to do a huge breadth of different activities afterwards as well. which is where it provides such a fantastic overall network to tie into and connect into for support.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Jackie, for sharing, some of your story in a nutshell as well. But first, which and it's good to see it resonates a lot with what we both shared and found through our research. So at this point, we'll these are again our details for those who wish, and I will stop the recording now so that we can open up the virtual floor, as it were, for discussions. So here.